We don't negotiate with killers, the human words that shattered the Galactic Council. The summons came at 3 in the morning, station time. I was already awake. I had been awake for 6 hours, sitting in the narrow bunk of the human delegation's quarters on Vel Soreth Station, reading the same intelligence brief over and over because I could not make the numbers inside it sit still in my head. 40 million. That was the number. 40 million people across 2 colony worlds, and the word the brief used for what happened to them was neutralized, which is the kind of word that someone invents when the real word is too heavy to carry. My name is Yara Osei. I was 31 years old and I held the rank of commander in the United Earth Diplomatic Corps, which sounds more impressive than it was. My actual job title was First Contact Liaison, which meant I was the person responsible for making sure human diplomats did not accidentally insult alien dignitaries by using the wrong hand gesture or the wrong honorific or the wrong tone of voice. I was a translator of culture, not language. I was very good at reading rooms. The message on my screen was from Delegate Fenn, the head of the human delegation. It said 3 words, "Chamber convenes now." I pulled on my dress uniform in the dark, clipped my translator earpiece into place, and walked out into the corridor. Vel Soreth Station is enormous. It orbits a brown dwarf in a system with no name, only a catalog number, chosen specifically because the system belongs to no one and therefore offends no one. The station itself was built over 400 years ago by a consortium of 11 species, and it shows, each section looks different, smells different, operates under different gravity settings. The human quarters are in Section 9, which smells faintly of recycled air and synthetic coffee, and which the other delegations regard the way you might regard a noisy neighbor who moved in recently and has not yet learned the customs of the building. I passed 2 Vorith diplomats in the corridor on my way to the central hub. The Vorith are crystalline, translucent, roughly humanoid in shape, and approximately 3,000 years ahead of us technologically. They looked at me the way they always looked at humans, with a kind of patient, slightly amused tolerance, the way a very old person looks at a child who has just said something endearing and incorrect. I nodded to them. They did not nod back. This was normal. The Grand Chamber is at the center of Vel Soreth Station. It is the largest room I had ever been in that was not an outdoor space. The ceiling is 40 meters high, constructed from a material that changes opacity based on the ambient light of whatever star the station is currently orbiting, so it always looks as though you are standing under an open sky. Around the perimeter of the chamber, at elevated tiers, sit the permanent seats of the 31 Galactic Council member species. Each seat is designed for the physiology of its occupant. Some are chairs, some are pools, some are sealed chambers with their own atmospheric mix. The human seats are simple chairs with good lumbar support, positioned on the second tier, third from the left. We have been members for 11 years, which in galactic terms means we arrived approximately 10 minutes ago. In the center of the chamber floor, there is a circular dais. It is raised about half a meter from the ground and it is where speakers stand when they address the full council. The dais has been used for 400 years. Every significant moment in galactic history for 4 centuries has been spoken from that circle. When I arrived, Delegate Fenn was already seated. He was a compact man in his 60s with silver hair and the careful, practiced stillness of someone who had spent 30 years learning to show nothing on his face. He handed me a second briefing tablet without looking at me. I read it in 40 seconds. The Keth had sent an envoy. I had never seen a Keth in person before. I had read the files. Everyone in Galactic Diplomatic Service had read the files. The Keth were a nomadic species from the outer spiral arm, predatory in biology and apparently in philosophy as well. They had no fixed territory, no permanent installations, no diplomatic history to speak of. For the past 2 centuries they had been expanding slowly into Council-adjacent space, and the Council had managed the situation with a combination of distance, careful boundary agreements, and the general hope that problems left alone sometimes resolve themselves. 40 million dead people suggested that this particular problem had not resolved itself. The Keth envoy was called Geralt Prime, which the translation matrix rendered as a title rather than a name. He entered the chamber from the south corridor at exactly the same moment that the session was called to order, which told me his timing was deliberate. He was large. The files had said large and I had thought I understood what that meant, but understanding a number and standing in a room with what it describes are different experiences. Geralt Prime stood nearly 4 meters tall on 4 heavily built legs, with 2 additional limb pairs carried in a folded position against his upper body. His exterior was armored in natural plating the color of old iron. His face, if you could call it that, was a cluster of sensory structures arranged around a central mouth, and none of those structures were eyes in any way I recognized. He moved to the center dais as though he owned it. The chamber went very quiet. The Vorath Council Chair, Senior Elder Varath, 4,000 years old, the longest-serving member of any council body in galactic history, opened the session with the formal greeting protocol that I had memorized during training. 43 languages, rendered simultaneously through the translator arrays. Welcome. We are gathered. Let there be understanding. I watched Geralt Prime stand motionless at the center of the dais while this greeting washed over him in 43 languages, and I noticed something that I noted in the margin of my briefing tablet. He was not listening. His sensory clusters were moving slowly across the chamber. Not toward Varath. Not toward the council seats. Across the walls, the exits, the tiers, the seated delegates. He was not here to receive a welcome. He was mapping the room. Delegate Fen touched my elbow and I looked up. He shook his head slightly. Not now. Pay attention. Sit still. We are guests. I looked back at the dais. Geralt Prime lowered his upper body slightly, which the translator array flagged as a greeting gesture. And then, in a voice that I felt in my chest before I heard it through my earpiece, he began to speak. The translator rendered his first words in smooth, courteous standard Galactic. He said, "We have come to discuss terms." I wrote one more note in the margin of my tablet. Whose terms, I wrote. Because that, it turned out, was the question that was going to determine the next 6 months of galactic history. And nobody else in the chamber seemed to be asking it. The first proposal came from the Sindari. I want to be fair to the Sindari, because they are not bad people. They are cautious people, which is not the same thing. They have been members of the Galactic Council for 900 years, long enough to remember the last large-scale conflict and long enough to have decided, as an institutional matter, that conflict is the worst possible outcome of any situation. I understand that perspective. I even respect it in the abstract. Delegate Fen leaned toward me as the Sindari ambassador, a tall, blue-mantled figure named Counselor Aerith, rose to address the chamber. He whispered, "Watch carefully. This is the galactic process. This is how they have kept peace for 800 years. So I watched. Aerith spoke for 20 minutes. His proposal was detailed, carefully structured, and genuinely generous. He offered the Keth free navigation rights through the Sindari Relay Corridor, a significant concession, since that corridor was one of the most efficient travel routes in the sector. He offered a formal recognition of Keth's sovereignty over their current range, which effectively doubled the territory they had held under the previous informal arrangement. He offered resources, which the Sindari called development assistance and which I mentally translated as payment. When Aerith sat down, there was a brief silence, and then Geralt Prime spoke again. More, the translator rendered. We require more. And here is the thing I need you to understand, because it is the thing that sat in my chest like a stone for the next 6 hours. Nobody in that chamber seemed surprised. The Lethmarin ambassador was next. The Lethmarin are the oldest species currently seated on the council. Their civilization predates humanity's by approximately 40,000 years, and their founding philosophers wrote the council charter. Their ambassador, Counselor Vensol, moved to the floor with the slow, deliberate grace of someone who had never in his life felt any urgency about anything. He offered an apology. A formal, official, recorded apology on behalf of the Galactic Council, acknowledging that historical territorial mapping decisions in the outer spiral arm may have created conditions of resource scarcity that contributed to Keth's societal stress, which may have in turn contributed to the recent unfortunate events. I stared at my tablet. The recent unfortunate events. 40 million people were the recent unfortunate events. I typed carefully into my briefing notes, 40 million people. I needed to keep writing it down because everyone else in the chamber seemed to be working very hard to find language that allowed them not to say it out loud. Vensol finished his apology and returned to his seat. There was a murmur of approval from several of the elder delegations. The Vorath Elder Varath made a gesture that my training identified as appreciation, a slow closing of the outer crystalline layer, like a slow blink. Geralt Prime stood still. Then he said, "We require more." He said it the same way he had said it the first time. The same tone, the same volume, the same absolute lack of any indication that the previous 40 minutes of offers and apologies had registered on him as meaningful in any way. Because they had not. I could see it now as clearly as I could see the walls of the chamber. He was not reacting to the content of what was being offered. He was simply noting the pattern of the offering, how readily it came, how quickly the apologies followed the refusals, how each no was followed immediately by a renegotiated yes. He was not at a negotiating table. He was running an experiment. Delegate Fenn saw me gripping my tablet too tightly and put his hand briefly on my wrist. I relaxed my fingers. I breathed. I watched. The Vorath spoke next. Varrath himself, which was significant, council chairs rarely addressed the floor directly. He proposed a buffer zone. 3 uninhabited systems, formally ceded to Keth sovereignty, positioned as a neutral corridor between Keth range and the nearest inhabited council worlds. It was a significant concession. 3 systems, even uninhabited ones, represented resources, positioning, and strategic access. The Vorath did not offer things like this lightly. Varrath made the offer in the measured, unhurried voice of someone who had handled 1,000 difficult negotiations over 4,000 years and was fully confident that this one was no different. Geralt Prime said, "We require more." The chamber shifted. Not a visible shift, not something you could point to, but I felt it, the way you feel a change in air pressure before a storm. The elder delegations were beginning to feel the first edge of something uncomfortable, and their response to discomfort was to offer more, because that was the mechanism they trusted. More had always worked before. More would work now. More was the grammar of galactic diplomacy, the sentence structure through which every conflict for 8 centuries had eventually resolved. I watched the chamber offer more. I watched Geralt Prime receive it. I started doing something that my diplomatic training explicitly discouraged, because diplomatic training is designed to help you see other cultures on their own terms rather than mapping human frameworks onto alien behavior. But my human framework was the only one I had, and it was screaming at me. I started making a list. The list had 2 columns. In the left column, I wrote what the council was offering. In the right column, I wrote what a predator learns when prey offers it something instead of fighting back. Navigation rights, I wrote on the left. It can be bought, I wrote on the right. Formal apology, I wrote on the left. It feels responsible for the attack, I wrote on the right. Territorial concession, I wrote on the left. It will give up space to avoid confrontation, I wrote on the right. I was midway through my 4th row when the session reached its lowest point. The Keth envoy, after 4 rounds of offers, tabled his own demand. It was not a counterproposal in any format the council recognized. It was simply a statement, delivered in the chest-deep voice that the translator rendered in patient, courteous standard galactic. The Keth required administrative rights over the Tez-Saren corridor. There was a silence in the chamber that lasted approximately 4 seconds. In a room where species with million-year institutional memory sit in deliberation, 4 seconds of silence is a very long time. The Tez-Saren corridor is not 3 uninhabited systems. It is a stretch of 14 populated worlds, home to 6 council species, with a combined population of approximately 900 million people. Administrative rights was the phrase the Keth used. The translator offered 3 possible renderings of the underlying Keth term, and all 3 of them meant, in varying degrees of directness, control. And then, I want to be precise about this, because it is the moment I will remember for the rest of my life, Councillor Varrath of the Vorath, 4,000 years old, the chair of the Galactic Council Security Committee, reached for his diplomatic tablet. He began drafting compromise language. I watched him do it. I watched his crystalline fingers move across the interface, and I understood from the angle of the screen and the speed of his movements that he was not drafting a refusal. He was drafting a counteroffer. He was figuring out which parts of the Tez-Saren corridor demand could be partially met, and how, and in what timeline. 900 million people. And the oldest mind in the room was already calculating which percentage of their autonomy could be offered up in exchange for a signature. Delegate Fenn was watching too. His face showed nothing. But his hands, folded in his lap, had gone very still in a way that I had learned meant he was working hard to keep them that way. I looked at the dais. Geralt Prime had not moved. His sensory clusters had settled, for the first time in the session, into a fixed orientation. They were pointed at Varrath's tablet. He was watching the math. He was watching the council calculate how much of 900 million people's lives was a reasonable opening bid. I thought about my grandmother. I thought about something she had told me when I was 7 years old and we were sitting on her porch in Accra, and I had asked her why she kept the old photographs on the wall, the ones from the conflicts of 2140. She had looked at me for a long moment and then said, "So I remember what it costs when good people decide that peace is worth any price." Delegate Fenn put his hand on my arm again. This time it was a reminder, "Sit down, be still, we are junior members, we do not have the standing to interrupt this process." But I was no longer sitting. I did not make a decision to stand up. I am not sure that is the right way to describe what happened. It was more like my body arrived at a conclusion before my mind finished the argument, the way your hand pulls back from fire before you consciously register the heat. I was on my feet. I was walking toward the floor. And every translator array in the Grand Chamber of the Galactic Council swiveled in the direction of the sound of a junior human officer's chair scraping back from the observer tier. Gerald Prime turned his sensory clusters toward me. I had about 4 seconds between leaving my seat and reaching the edge of the floor space, and in those 4 seconds I became aware of several things simultaneously. Delegate Fenn was saying my name very quietly and very urgently behind me. Every eye, sensory cluster, photoreceptor, and atmospheric sensor in that chamber was now oriented in my direction. The Vorith Elder Varrath had stopped typing. I was not recognized to speak. I had no standing to address the council floor. I was a first contact liaison holding the rank of commander in an 11-year-old member state's diplomatic corps, which in this room was roughly equivalent to being a child who had wandered into a formal meeting of heads of state. I stopped at the edge of the floor space, just outside the ring that marked the boundary of the speaker's area. I did not step onto the dais. I did not need to. The translator arrays had already locked onto my voice. Gerald Prime looked at me with complete stillness. Every species in that room looked at me with varying degrees of surprise, confusion, and in the case of the Vorith Elder, something that might have been quiet irritation. I said, "We don't negotiate with killers." The translator arrays rendered it in 43 languages simultaneously. I said it simply, the way you say a fact. Not loudly. Not with my voice shaking, though my hands were shaking, though every nerve in my body was informing me in great detail that this was not a safe situation. But the words themselves came out flat and clear, the way a compass needle points, not because it has decided to, but because that is the direction it was made for. The chamber was completely silent. I kept going. I said, "I want to say something clearly, because this chamber has spent 6 hours finding careful language for things that should be called by their real names. 2 colony worlds were destroyed. 40 million people are gone. This was not a territorial dispute. This was not a resource conflict. This was not provoked by historical mapping decisions or resource scarcity or anything else that has been offered as an explanation in this chamber today." Gerald Prime had not moved. His stillness was total, the way a very large animal goes still, not because it is calm, but because it is deciding. I did not look away from him. I said, "The Keth envoy did not come here today to negotiate. I have been watching him for 6 hours, and what I have seen is not a diplomatic delegation. What I have seen is an assessment. Every offer this council has made today has been received not as a concession but as a data point. What can we get? How fast will they give it? How much will they offer before they say no, and when the no finally comes, how much of what they offered can we keep anyway?" I heard Delegate Fenn's voice again behind me, very low, saying my name. I continued. I said, "My species has a very specific history with this pattern. We learned it the hardest possible way, and we spent a very long time afterward studying it so that we would recognize it when it came again. I am standing here because I recognize it now." I looked at Varrath for a moment. Then back at Gerald Prime. I said, "Giving territory to something that wants territory does not satisfy it. Giving resources to something that wants dominance does not satisfy it. Apologizing to something that feels no grievance, only appetite, does not satisfy it. What it does is teach it that the way to get more is to ask more. And the asking will never stop, because the asking is not the point. The taking is the point. And right now, the answer this chamber is giving is that the taking is welcome. Bring more. Take more. We will find the language to describe it as a negotiated outcome. The chamber made a sound. Not quite voices, more like the atmospheric equivalent of intake of breath, species-wide, a shift in the environmental readings of the room. Gerald Prime finally moved. He rose to his full height. 4 meters of natural armor, standing at the center of the most powerful deliberative body in the known galaxy, orienting every sensory cluster in his head toward one junior human officer standing at the edge of the floor without recognition, without authority, without anything except the 7 words she had already said. He spoke. The translator rendered it calmly, because that was what the translator did, render everything in the same measured standard galactic, regardless of the weight of what it was rendering. He said, "This one speaks without recognition. This one has no standing in this chamber. This one species has been members for 11 years. By what right does it speak to us?" The chamber waited. I said, "By the right of 40 million dead people who do not have a seat at this table and who need someone to say their name out loud." Another silence. Then I said, "And because the species in this room who have been members for 400 years and 800 years and 4,000 years have, with great respect, been members long enough to forget what it looks like when something is not here to negotiate. My species has not forgotten. We do not have the luxury of forgetting. We came from a planet where we had to learn this lesson over and over again, in blood, across centuries, until we finally got it right, or right enough to still be here. What you are watching right now is not a diplomatic process. It is something older than diplomacy. And if this chamber does not recognize it for what it is, the Tessarian corridor will not be the last thing on the table. It will be the first." Gerald Prime stood very still. I stood very still. The room between us felt like a wire pulled tight. Then Varrath set down his tablet. It was such a small gesture. He simply placed it on the surface beside him and folded his crystalline hands. But every delegation in that room saw it, and the significance was immediate. The Vorath Elder had stopped drafting. The calculation had stopped. The compromise language was not being written anymore. Gerald Prime turned his sensory clusters toward Varrath. Varrath looked back at him with 4,000 years of patience and something new in his face, or whatever the Vorath equivalent of a face was, something that had not been there 6 hours ago. I stepped back from the edge of the floor. My legs were not entirely steady. Delegate Fenn caught my arm before I sat down and held it for a moment. He did not say anything. But his hand was gripping my arm the way someone grips something solid when the ground has just shifted under them. They pulled me out of the chamber 11 minutes later. A Vorath security officer and the human delegation's protocol coordinator, moving on either side of me through the side corridor, not grabbing me, not making a scene, just making it clear in the practiced and professional way of people who manage uncomfortable situations that I was going to come with them now. I went. I did not have the energy left to be difficult about it. They put me in a waiting room in the human delegation section. The room had 4 chairs, a water dispenser, and a viewport that looked out over the docking arm. A long row of ships in berths, their running lights blinking slow and steady, the brown dwarf hanging in the distance like a dim coal. I sat in one of the chairs and looked at the viewport and waited. The waiting took 2 hours. In those 2 hours, I learned things not from the meeting but from the fragments that found their way to me through the station's soft architecture of connections. The first was a message from a Sindari junior attaché named Counselor Orin. I had met him twice at pre-session receptions, a young diplomat, reserved, with the Sindari habit of listening more than he spoke. The message was text only, sent through the delegation's secure channel. It said, "I want you to know that my homeworld is 3 light-years from Keth range. We have not said this in open session because our senior delegation believes that stating proximity implies fear, and fear weakens a negotiating position. But I have wanted to say what you said for 2 years. On behalf of the 7 billion people on my homeworld who do not attend council sessions, thank you." I read it 3 times. Then I set the tablet down and looked at the viewport for a while. The second thing that found me was not a message. It was a person. A Lethmaran archivist named Fensol, not the counselor but a much younger member of their delegation, assigned to documentation, came to the door of the waiting room and asked, very politely, if he could speak with me for a moment. I said yes. He came in and stood near the door with the careful posture of someone who was not certain they were doing something permitted. He said, "In 4,000 years of galactic diplomatic history, no member species has ever formally cited the Munich Agreement of 1938. We have it in the archive. We considered it a localized human phenomenon, a specific pathology of your developmental period. He paused. He looked at me with very large, pale eyes. He said, Counselor Vensol did not sleep last night. He has not said why, but I believe it is because what you said this morning is an argument he has been unable to stop thinking about since your briefing on human conflict history was submitted to the Council Library 3 years ago. We catalogued it under sociological development, early period. He looked at me carefully and said, I think we catalogued it incorrectly. Then he left. Delegate Fenn arrived 40 minutes after that. He came in and closed the door and sat down in the chair across from me and looked at me without speaking for a long moment. He was a man who had spent 30 years in diplomatic service, and I had genuinely no idea what he was going to say. What he said was, do you know what you have done? I said what was true. He said, you may have ended the Keth negotiations. I said, I think the Keth ended the negotiations when they destroyed 2 inhabited worlds. He looked at me for another moment. Then he said, the Vorith Elder has requested an extended recess. The Keth envoy has returned to his ship. The chamber is not in session. I have been informed that Varrath is meeting privately with the heads of delegation from 7 member species. I have not been invited to that meeting. I said, are we being censured? He said, the Vorith have filed a protocol complaint regarding unauthorized floor address by an unrecognized speaker. Yes. I said, is that bad? He said, it is extremely bad by every metric that applied to this situation 4 hours ago. He paused. And then he said, I am not certain those metrics still apply. He stood up. He went to the viewport and looked out at the docking arm. He stood there for a long time. Then he said, without turning around, my father was in the Lagos settlement during the resource conflicts. He was 12 years old. He told me once that the thing he remembered most was not the conflict itself. It was the years before it, when everyone around him could see what was coming and nobody said it out loud because saying it out loud felt like causing it. I did not say anything. Fenn said, you are going to be disciplined. The protocol violation is real and the complaint is valid under council procedure. I cannot protect you from that. I said, I know. He turned around from the viewport. He said, the Lethmarin archivist who came to see you. What did he say? I told him. He was quiet. Then he said, Counselor Vensol has not spoken publicly yet. If he speaks, if the founder of the council charter stands up and endorses what you said, the shape of this changes completely. I said, I did not say what I said to change the shape of anything. I said it because it was true and because someone needed to. Fenn looked at me for a long time. Then he said something I did not expect. He said, I know. I am not criticizing you. I am telling you that you may have accidentally done something that 30 years of professional diplomacy has not managed to do. He sat back down. His voice was careful when he said the next part. He said, the Keth envoy did not leave in anger. I want you to understand that. He left to communicate with his command structure, because something unexpected happened in the chamber today and unexpected things require consultation. He turned to look at the viewport and when he turned back his expression was different, not the diplomatic neutrality, but something quieter. He said, Garo Prime spent 6 hours in that room watching the Galactic Council confirm everything the Keth have probably assumed about us for 2 centuries. That we value peace more than anything else. That we will give almost anything to avoid a confrontation. And then a junior human officer who had no right to speak said 7 words that were the first thing in 6 hours that he could not have predicted. And he left. Not because he was offended. Because he had to reconsider. I said, what does that mean for the Tez-Sarin corridor? Fenn said, I don't know yet. I said, what does it mean for us? He looked at me steadily. He said, it means that for the first time in 11 years, the Galactic Council is taking the human delegation's perspective seriously. It also means you are almost certainly going to be removed from active duty pending a review. I said, I understand. He said, I am not sure you do. He leaned forward. He said, Yara. If Vensol speaks. If the Vorith Elder sets aside the protocol complaint. If the 7 delegations in that private meeting right now decide that what you said is something they can no longer afford not to have said, you will not be removed from anything. You will be the most consequential junior officer in the history of human galactic membership. And that is not a comfortable thing to be. It is a very exposed thing to be. And the Keth will remember your name. I looked at my hands. I said, 40 million people. He said, yes. I said, someone had to say it. He said, very quietly, yes. I know. That is the part that is keeping me awake. He left. I sat in the waiting room alone. Through the viewport, the brown dwarf burned dimly at the center of its empty system, and the ships in the docking arm blinked their steady lights, and somewhere in one of those berths the Keth envoy was speaking to his command structure about something that had not gone the way he had expected. I thought about my grandmother's photographs. I thought about what she had told me, the thing about peace being worth any price, and about what it costs when good people believe that. I thought about the Tez-Sarin corridor and 900 million people who had no idea that their lives had been placed on a table in a chamber 40 meters high, and that for 6 hours the oldest and wisest minds in the galaxy had been calculating how much of those lives was a reasonable concession. And then I thought about Fonsol the archivist, standing in the doorway, saying, we catalogued it incorrectly. Maybe that was the real thing I had done today. Not stopped anything. Not changed anything. Not saved anyone, not yet. Just recatalogued something. Just put the right label on a pattern that people had been trying to call by softer names for a very long time. We don't negotiate with killers. 7 words. The most expensive 7 words I would ever speak, and the cheapest thing I could have said, given what the alternative was. The war lasted 19 months. I want to be honest about that up front, because what followed the Grand Chamber session is sometimes described in terms that make it sound clean. As though the moment Varrath set down his tablet, the shape of everything changed. As though the species of the Galactic Council all looked at each other and straightened their spines, and the Keth saw this and recalculated, and the problem resolved itself in some orderly way. That is not what happened. The Keth left Vel Soreth Station without a signed agreement. The Council's extended recess turned into a 3-week adjournment. During that adjournment, the Keth struck a third target. This time it was a Vorith colony. A medium-sized settlement on a moon at the edge of Vorith sovereign space, not their core worlds, not a population center, but Vorith. 400,000 people. In the diplomatic calculus that the Galactic Council had been running for 8 centuries, this was significant in a way that the first 2 strikes were not, because the first 2 strikes had been against less powerful species. Hitting the Vorith was not reconnaissance. It was a statement. It was the Keth telling the chamber, your hesitation has been noted. Your offer of buffer zones and navigation rights has been noted. And here is what we think of it. The emergency session was called within hours. I was reinstated to the human delegation for that session, not formally, not without the pending protocol review still on my file, but Delegate Fenn simply brought me with him and no one stopped us. The Vorith were not inclined to spend much time on procedural complaints in the hours after 400,000 of their citizens had been killed. Varrath opened the session himself. He stood at the center dais and he spoke for 12 minutes without notes, which I was later told was unprecedented. The Vorith elder always used notes. His voice was its usual measured instrument, but underneath it was something else, something I had never heard from him in all my months on Vel Soreth Station. He cited, by name, the human delegation's concern as raised in the previous session. He said, a junior member of our council, 11 years in standing, identified a pattern of behavior that this body failed to recognize despite 400 years of institutional experience. He looked directly at the human section when he said it, and then he looked away. He said, we will not make that error again. The vote to authorize a military response took 40 minutes. 31 member species. 28 voted yes. 2 abstained. 1, a minor species with a single colony world directly adjacent to Keth space, who would have been the most vulnerable to reprisal, voted yes anyway. The resolution carried. I remember the sound in the chamber when the count was read. It was not a cheer. It was quieter than that. It was the sound of a room full of very old civilizations arriving at a decision they had not made in 8 centuries and feeling the full weight of it. There is no good sound for that. It falls somewhere between relief and grief, and it stays in a room after the voices that made it have gone. The Joint Fleet Assembly took 4 months. Humanity was assigned a co-command role, which was not something any of us had anticipated. The Council's reasoning was stated formally in the resolution's operational annex, in careful galactic diplomatic language that translated, essentially, to, your species wrote the tactical doctrine we need and the rest of us haven't used this kind of capacity in 800 years. Delegate Fenn handed me my new assignment orders in the corridor outside the chamber. A field liaison role, embedded with the Joint Command staff. Not a desk assignment. Not an observer position. I looked at the orders. Then at him. He said, "You said someone needed to say it. Now someone needs to do it." I said, "I'm a diplomat, not a soldier." He said, "Right now the galaxy needs people who remember that those two things are not always separate." I folded the orders. I put them in my jacket. The war was hard. I will not soften that. The Keth were not a symbolic enemy, not a paper opposition, not a force that collapsed when the Council finally pushed back. They were a genuine military power with 2 centuries of expanding operations behind them, and they had made good use of the Council's long patience. They had fortified their range. They had positioned assets throughout the outer spiral arm. They had, in all probability, spent the months of negotiation not reconsidering their position but consolidating it. There were losses. The Sindari lost a cruiser in the first engagement of the Tessaran approach, 48 crew, gone in 6 minutes of contact. A Lethmaran colony relay station was destroyed in month 7, though the civilian population had been evacuated. In month 11, a human frigate, the first human military vessel to fire in an active engagement since Earth's own century-old territorial disputes, took serious damage in the defense of the Vorith resupply corridor and limped back to Vel Soreth with a third of her crew in medical. I was at the Joint Command Center when the report came in. I filed the casualty notice and then I went to the small observation room at the end of the command deck and stood there for a long time looking at nothing in particular. A Vorith commander named Sinvar found me there. He was one of the oldest serving military officers in the Vorith forces, which meant he had been in service for several centuries, and he approached things with the same crystalline stillness that all Vorith carried. He stood beside me and looked at the same not particular anything I was looking at. He said, "You are thinking about the cost." I said, "Yes." He said, "So are we." He paused. Then he said, "We were thinking about a different kind of cost, before. We were thinking about the cost of conflict. We did not think clearly about the cost of the alternative." I said, "What changed your mind?" He said, "You did." Then he corrected himself. He said, "No, what you said did. There is a difference." I have been trying to find the correct formulation, because it matters. What you said is what changed the calculation. Not your authority. Not your standing. Not your rank or your species membership length or any of the things that should have determined who had the right to speak in that chamber. Just the words. Just whether they were true. I said, "Were they true?" He looked at me with the patient expression that very long-lived beings develop when they are faced with a question from someone much younger. He said, "The Tessaran corridor was not taken. 900 million people are still governed by their own councils. The Keth have retreated from 40% of the territory they held at the start of this conflict. These are facts. You may evaluate whether they constitute truth. The war ended in month 19. Not with a dramatic battle. Not with a final, conclusive engagement. It ended the way most real conflicts end, with attrition and exhaustion and a point at which the Keth command structure calculated that continued operations were no longer producing the returns that had made the campaign worthwhile. The Council did not pursue them into their home range. There was a long argument about whether this was restraint or repetition of the old pattern, and I was part of that argument, and I do not think it was ever fully resolved. But the fighting stopped. The Tessaran corridor remained under Council jurisdiction. An exclusion boundary was established, with monitoring stations and a mutual non-aggression framework, not a concession framework, but a deterrence framework, which is a fundamentally different kind of document. Geralt Prime was not present for the signing. I noticed that. I am writing this in my quarters on Vel Soreth Station, 6 months after the framework was signed. My daughter is 9 years old and she is on Earth with her father and she has been sending me messages asking when I am coming home, and also asking me something else, because her class did a unit on recent galactic history and apparently her teacher mentioned, in passing, that her mother said something once that is now in the Galactic Council's official record. She sent me a message that said, "Mom, why does the whole galaxy know those 7 words? Why did saying them matter so much?" I have been thinking about how to answer her for 3 weeks. I have been thinking about what it actually means to say a true thing in the right room at the right time. Whether it is brave. Whether it is simply necessary. Whether there is a difference between those two things. I have been thinking about Counselor Oren's message, and Fonsol standing in the doorway saying we catalogued it incorrectly, and Sinvar beside me in the observation room saying the words, just whether they were true. I have been thinking about my grandmother and the photographs on the wall. Here is what I am going to tell my daughter. I am going to tell her that we were the youngest species in that room. We had been members for 11 years in a chamber where others had held their seats for 4,000. We were the ones who came from a planet where every century had been a lesson written in the worst possible ink about what happens when good, wise, experienced people talk carefully around a thing instead of naming it plainly. We did not have the luxury of forgetting those lessons. We were too young. We had not had time to archive them under sociological development, early period, the way the Lethmarin had. We still carried them the way you carry something recent, in the body, not just the mind. That is our advantage, I am going to tell her. Not our technology. Not our strength. Not anything that the other species don't also have in some form. Our advantage is that we have not yet learned to be comfortable with comfortable lies. We don't negotiate with killers. It wasn't a brilliant strategic insight. It wasn't a complex political argument. It was something a 7-year-old on a porch in Accra could have told you, if anyone had thought to ask her. It was the kind of obvious thing that becomes very difficult to say when you have spent centuries building frameworks designed to make difficult things easier to manage. I said it because I was young enough, and knew enough, and human enough, to not yet know all the reasons why saying it was complicated. And because 40 million people needed someone to say their names out loud, in a room full of the wisest minds in the galaxy, where everyone was too careful to say the simple thing. I am going to tell my daughter this. And I am going to tell her one more thing. I am going to tell her that the words cost something. That the 19 months after them cost something. That the people who didn't come back from the Tessaran approach cost something that no treaty language has the right words for. Truth, said plainly, is not free. It just happens to be cheaper than the alternative. She is 9 years old. She will understand part of that now and the rest of it later. And maybe that is enough. The brown dwarf burns in the viewport. The ships blink their steady lights. The council chamber is quiet tonight, the way it is between sessions, large and still and full of the weight of everything that has been said inside it over 400 years. Somewhere in the outer spiral arm, the Keth are watching the new monitoring stations that ring their boundary. They are watching, and calculating, and deciding what the future holds. They know our name now. All of it, not just the 7 words, but the 19 months that came after them. The species that sent ships when it could have sent apologies. The species that remembered, in the one moment it mattered, what its grandmothers had told it about the cost of comfortable silence. They know we remember. And I think that matters more than anything else. I think that is, in the end, the thing that actually shattered the Galactic Council, not the protocol violation, not the diplomatic incident, not the headline that every news relay in the sector ran for 3 weeks. What shattered was the assumption. The assumption that the newest species in the room had nothing to teach the oldest ones. The assumption that 11 years of membership meant 11 years of nothing worth hearing. The assumption that youth, in a civilization of ancient things, was only a limitation. It turns out that sometimes youth is a memory. And memory, it turns out, is the one weapon that 800 years of peace had not prepared anyone for.